Assalamu alaikum everyone. Hello everyone. Thank you all for attending this book launch by the Al-Khoei Foundation. I am extremely delighted to have with us all the way from Rome Professor Christopher Clohessy. I met Professor Clohessy at ICAS when he was presenting a paper on Lady Zainab, and I was astounded by one, his oratory, and two, the depth he took up on when presenting his paper. And ever since, he has been involved in a number of television programs and podcasts and events that he's been involved in, and he's captivated the minds of young people. He's published two works not too long ago, one on Lady Zainab and one on Lady Fatima. But this publication, between amongst our presence, is Angels Hastening. It's a publication on dreams that have kind of been documented in history that speak of or mention the event of Karbala. Professor Clohessy is, I've got a short biography I'd like to read out, just kind of set the context. Is a South African Catholic priest who holds a BST, which is a Bachelor of Sacred Theology from the Pontifical Urbananium University of Rome, and a PhD from the Pontifical Institute from Arabic and Islamic Studies, also in Rome. He is at present a resident faculty member of PIS AI, lecturing there in Shi'i Islamic Studies, Quranic and Islamic Ethics, and is a visiting lecturer at the Pontifical Bida College in Rome, where he lectures in fundamental theology and Maryrology. He also studied Arabic in Cairo and has written and lectured extensively about Imam Hussein, Lady Fatima, and Lady Zainab. His books include Fatima, Daughter of Muhammad, and Half of My Heart, which is about Lady Zainab. Now, this event is about a book launch, as you can see here, and we will be posting information on how you can purchase and acquire this book. It's available online. I believe that the team will be posting on YouTube in the comment section details on how to acquire the book. I will also do the same after the seminar is finished, and please feel free, if you do join, if you want to buy a book, you can do so after the program. And Professor Clohessy has promised to sign and take a picture with you as well. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Professor Clohessy to share his thoughts.
Many thanks. It's been, I think, 2 years since I was here for a conference on Al-Khoei, and I remember we were downstairs, not here in the masjid, but I think we were downstairs or upstairs in an adjacent hall. So I'm going to talk until somebody stops me. That's how it works. I just talk, and eventually maybe for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then somebody can stop me. It was on an autumn night in Medina in the year 680, the same night on which Al-Khoei was murdered, that Salama, who was the last surviving widow of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad by 680 had already been dead for almost half a century. She was a woman already well into her 80s on that night, and she was woken up by this vision of her late husband, the Prophet of Islam. And at the moment that Salama saw this vision of the Prophet, she joined this long line of Muslims who, irrespective of their gender, irrespective of their level of taqwa, irrespective of whether they were good or bad Muslims, were recipients of dreams and of visions, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day. And at the heart of these dreams, and many of these dreams contained visions of the jinn who were lamenting the death of Al-Khoei, or angels coming with messages. Many of these dreams were textured with the dust of Iraq and of the blood of the martyrs. But at the heart of these dreams, of course, is Karbala. Salama's vision was going to find its way into lots of ancient texts, not only texts of hadith and theology, but also biographies of cities. For example, the famous Syrian Ibn Asakir, who wrote this long history about his own city of Damascus. So that's perhaps the first theme of this book, that we shouldn't be surprised to find that very serious theologians and historians, both Sunni and Shia, talk about angels and the visions of angels as part of history, as part of the history of God's intervention. And in fact, they describe angels with the same seriousness with which they describe battles and other events. When Islam entered into the world of Christianity and Judaism, it carried with it something that the Christian and Jewish communities already knew, that in all of the great monotheistic faith traditions, religious history and secular history run along lines, parallel lines together. They are two different histories, but they are bound together and they run side by side. Maybe for the secular historian writing in a city like London today, there is no such thing as sacred history. It has no meaning for him. Secular history is all that matters to him. He's only interested in religious history in as much as it impacts upon his idea of secular history. But for the believer, for the believing Christian or Muslim or Jewish person, secular and sacred history run together. God's movement, God's interventions from sacred history into secular history. God's voice as it interrupts secular history, or as God's messengers interrupt secular history. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be the giving of the covenant to Moses on Sinai. It could be the Last Supper of Jesus. It could be the birth of Imam Ali in the Kaaba, or it could, of course, be Karbala. But these are historical moments in which secular history is invaded by sacred history, where God makes his presence felt. So it's not surprising that you could read historians in both the Sunni and the Shia traditions and find them talking about the visits of angels as historical events. So that's the first theme of the book, which we will come back to in a moment, the presence of the angels as historical witnesses and messengers. A second theme is this idea not just of secular and sacred history, but of angels themselves, because once again, Islam entered into a Christian and Jewish world when it entered into Syria, when it came down to North Africa, where there were already people who had a vivid belief in angels, who had no doubt that angels existed and that angels played a role. They had a certain function and a certain nature. In fact, in the Islamic body of writings, there is far less written about angels than there is in Christianity and Judaism. But the fact that many Muslims haven't written about angels does not take away the fact that angels form the second part of the Islamic creed, belief in God, and then, before even his books and his messengers, belief in his angels. Therefore, angels in Islam, more so than in Christianity, form a crucial part of the history of God's intervention. Because in Christianity, angels are not tied up with revelation, but in Islam, it is Jibreel who is the bringer from the seventh heaven of the text or of the message of the Quran. So that angels are indispensable to Islamic belief. The lack of writing about angels in Islam is possibly because Islam puts much more attention on revelation than it does on the bringer of revelation. So the first element of this book is the fact that we shouldn't separate secular history from religious history. They run together. And the second is that angels play a crucial role in the Karbala story and in the life of Al-Khoei and the members of the Ahl Bayt. The third element of this book is dreams. The Quran, in various places, uses a number of Arabic words to describe dreams. It certainly uses the word ru'ya, which means really a vision more than a dream, sometimes a vision that could happen during the day. It also uses the word manam, but manam really means sleep, although there are moments in the Quran when manam doesn't mean sleep as much as it means something that somebody saw while they were sleeping. And then, of course, the word hulm, with its plural ahlam, but hulm almost always refers to dreams that are bad. Dreams that bring bad news rather than good news. And the Prophet himself makes this distinction in various texts of hadith. But dreams, like angels, have enfolded themselves deeply into Islamic life, almost every aspect, in fact, of human life. And dreams and angels seem to me to have similar functions. Sometimes they are there to warn, sometimes to chastise, sometimes to commiserate, as we will see, sometimes to commend or to praise, or sometimes commanding or informing. Some scholars think that, in a sense, Islam began with a vision. It began with a dream, in the sense of the Prophet experiencing this angelic encounter, so that the whole of Islam is visionary in this sense, and the whole of the text of Islam, the Quran, is a visionary text. So the one thing that is clear and became clear to me is that Islam is not short of men and women who were interested in dreams and their religious significance. And it seems to me that people are as interested now as they were in the time of Salama about what dreams meant. The Prophet himself, we know, was very keen that if any of his companions had dreamt, they should come and tell him what they would had dreamt, and he would become the interpreter. But from that time on, there was a great interest in the interpretation of dreams down through the centuries in Islamic writings. The interesting thing is that the dreams about Karbala don't need explanation. They are absolutely, brutally clear. Other dreams were taken to the Prophet or to various other people, mystics, for explanation. But the dreams about Karbala are not mystic dreams in the sense of the message is terrifyingly clear. There is a clarity to them. It was before Yazid that Lady Zainab, who spoke with the tongue of her father Ali, because she was able to speak with such eloquence that she inherited from him. It was really before Yazid and perhaps Ibn Ziyad that Lady Zainab began this tradition of memorizing and repeating what had happened at Karbala. And those stories, those majalis, would be passed down through the centuries. But the dreams were also a way of passing down this terrifying history of the persecution and the killing of so many members of the Ahlul Bayt. As they progress, and so this book is specifically about dreams either that the Prophet himself had before the birth of Al-Khoei, in which he has angels coming to congratulate him and commiserate him in the same moment. Lady Fatima herself has a number of dreams of angels, and she shares in the dreams of her grandfather. Dreams of Al-Khoei, visions that he has of his own grandfather at the tomb of his grandfather before he leaves to Karbala. Dreams that Salama has and voices that she hears. Positive dreams in the sense that these are made to important people, but there are also other dreams. They are the dreams of the people who killed Al-Khoei. Dreams predicting what their fate will be. Dreams warning them of the terrible punishment they will face. So I've divided the book as much as I could into the dreams that come to members of the Ahlul Bayt about the death of Al-Khoei, and the dreams that come to Yazid and his followers, including the wife of Yazid, about what they have done and the fate that awaits them. So I might just develop very quickly some of these themes. As the dreams progress, they become more and more populated by very interesting characters, and more populated by increased detail. And we will see this now. The dust, for example. In the earliest dreams, it is the Prophet who appears to Salama. And he comes to her in a dream at night, and he has dust on his forehead and his head. And that is the only mention of dust. But as the years go by and the dreams are recounted, that dust then becomes not dust on his head, but dust that he is holding in his hand, turning it around and around, because Salama sees him doing this and asks, "What is this that you are holding?" Then the dust is given a certain color and texture. It becomes red dust, and it becomes a piece of earth, and ultimately a piece of the dust or the earth of a place called the land of sorrow and calamity, Karbala. And finally, it is the dust that is placed into a little glass vial. by the Prophet himself, almost certainly, or perhaps the vial is given to him by Jibril, which he entrusts to the care of Salama. Salama watches that vial from the time of the death of the Prophet until the moment of Karbala. Every day she looks at that vial, because she's been promised that on the day that that dust turns to blood, she will know that Al-Khoei has been killed. And on the night of Karbala, that dust has changed to blood. So there is a development in the theme just of the dust. And these are the things that interest me, how the elements are given a certain texture. There's also a development in the character of the visiting angel, who we're not always sure about. Certainly, first of all, this angel, or this angelic being who appears to the Prophet and talks with him in a visionary form in the house of Salama, this angel makes certain gestures. He beats the ground with his wing or with his fist to produce for the Prophet dust from Karbala, or he extends his wing from Medina all the way to Karbala to produce for the Prophet dust, the dust on which his grandson will die. He races between heaven and earth. There's a famous theology of the fact that Ali, and the declaration of who Ali is, has to be done by the Prophet, because if he hasn't done it, the message is not fully proclaimed. Now, in the dreams, one gets the impression that Jibril is doing the same thing, because he says to the Prophet, I bring you news of a grandson who your community will kill. And the Prophet says to him, I don't need a grandson who my community will kill. And Fatima says, I don't need a son who my community will kill. And 3 times Jibril launches himself from the earth back to heaven and then rockets down again in order to get the Prophet to accept this message. And finally, the 3rd time, he accepts it, because Jibril says in his blood will be the wilaya, will be this crucial element. And finally the Prophet accepts it. But there's this marvelous, impatient, frenetic movement of Jibril, who knows that the message has not yet been performed. So there's a development in the movements of this angelic visitor. Now, it is Jibril who dominates this book. The trouble is, it's very hard to find out who Jibril really is. He's never ever called an angel by the Quran. He's called a ruh, but never a malak, an angel. So that's already a puzzle for us. He's named 3 times in the Quranic text, always as Jibril or Jibril. It's written in a number of ways in the Arabic. The Sunni texts of Hadith give us a very confusing picture of what Jibril actually looks like. Certainly Jibril is seen by the Prophet, and he is seen by the Prophet in his original form, so insists one of the Prophet's wives, covered with all of these wings, covered with, occupying a seat that extends between heaven and earth, his massive bulk filling this great throne. More than once, Aisha describes the mechanics of revelation, but she never gives a description of what Jibril looks like. And it seems to me the Prophet never tells her what Jibril actually looks like. Sometimes the Prophet sees Jibril as a man, not only in a vision in his heart, but actually as a physical man. We have enough narratives to tell us, for example, that at the famous Battle of the Trench, Jibril was there as a soldier, and he's pictured as brushing dust out of his hair during the battle, and it is Jibril who is present. We know also that there was a famous companion called Dihya, and Dihya, Jibril used to appear in his form, and people used to think it was a companion, and it wasn't a companion. It was Jibril, and the Prophet keeps explaining that was Jibril. He appears once as a traveler in this famous hadith, Jibril. He appears as a traveler, except he's dressed in sparkling white vestments, clothing. There is no dirt on him, but he has been traveling. He explains the fundamentals of Islam to the companions and then disappears, and the Prophet says that was Jibril. So he's a fascinating character, but we still don't know what he is or who Jibril is. The text of the Quran uses the word ruh, spirit, to to describe him. In fact, that word occurs 21 times, I think, in the Quranic text, and almost always commentators say that Jibril is the Ruh. He is the Spirit who descends with the revelation. But in fact, the text doesn't actually classify that Jibril is an angel or a Ruh. He is given the name Ruh, but never anything else. And in fact, the trouble with the word spirit is that it carries a certain weight in Christian theology. So if you write the word spirit with a capital S, people begin to think that Jibril is Ruh al-Qudus, which doesn't translate as the Holy Spirit. In Arabic, and you're all better Arabists than I am, but Ruh al-Qudus cannot ever be translated as the Holy Spirit. It means the Spirit of holiness. It's a different thing. But if you put spirit with a capital letter, people begin to think that somehow Jibril is the Holy Spirit. But in Christianity, the Holy Spirit is a completely different thing, so it just brings confusion. It's better to remember that the word angel doesn't refer to function. Doesn't refer to nature. It refers to function. An angel is an angel because he's a malak, he's a messenger. So I suspect myself that Jibril was indeed an angel, but he had a higher rank than all the others. And that is why he is also called Ruh, the faithful spirit, because he is an angel, but who has a specific rank as the bringer of revelation. And that is why in some of the texts in the Sunni writings of these dreams, they insist that it was not Jibril who the prophet met in the house of Salama, because they're terrified that we might think that the message about Hussein was then part of revelation. Well, we know it wasn't part of revelation, but the early Sunni texts don't say that it was Jibril. They say it was an angel who had never been sent before. In other words, not an angel who'd ever brought revelation, some other angel. And in some early texts, Ibn Hanbal, the angel of the rain, but not Jibril. But it's quite clear from many of the texts, both Sunni and Shia, that this vision that the Prophet had in the house of Salama was a vision of Jibril. It is, we will talk about it now, it is a most beautiful event, because Al-Hussein at that time is a tiny little boy, maybe 3. And Jibril comes to the Prophet in Salama's house, and Salama is given the command to guard the door, to hold the door, because the Prophet, while he is talking to Jibril, and we need to understand that Jibril didn't only bring revelation, he often had encounters with the Prophet that weren't about revelation, they were about other things. The Prophet wants the door guarded by dear Salama, but she is not fast enough for this little boy Hussein, who wants to be inside with his grandfather. So he darts between her legs or around her as she's trying to, and rams in and climbs onto the shoulders of his grandfather. I'm not convinced that Al-Hussein sees Jibril. If he does, there's no mention of it. But at that moment, the Prophet is in conversation with this visitor, and Jibril asks him this terrible question, do you love him? And the Prophet says, of course I love him. I love him more than life itself. And then Jibril talks about Karbala. It is the most extraordinary encounter, and it forms the center of this book. This moment in the house, when the house of Salama becomes a locus of divine activity, a moment when heaven meets earth with terrifying news that is going to have exceptionally great consequences for everybody. Because after all, had it not been for Karbala, things would be very different, and we wouldn't have these models by which we could live. I've still got some time, haven't I?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So the first thing is that it's very hard for me to conclude that the Prophet only heard these things. No, I'm convinced that he had visions, that he actually saw Jibril, probably in human form, the way Maryam saw Jibril in the form of this perfect man. I suspect that the Prophet himself, because the language of Jibril handing him dust, or beating the ground with his wing or with his fist, or racing between heaven and earth, that language suggests a physical vision rather than just the Prophet hearing a voice. If anybody else, Salama or Al-Hussein actually also saw Jibril, the texts don't ever say. Salama knew that something was going on, but we have no evidence that she looked into the room. She stood by the door and she overheard things, but we have no evidence that she herself saw this angelic visitor in a human form. The conversation between the prophet and this angel before him grows more and more emotional as the texts go on, and occasionally the prophet himself takes the lead in the conversation. In the early accounts, he is silent. Jibril brings him this terrible news about the future death of Al-Hussein, and the prophet makes no reply at all. It is simply reported as a fact. But as the texts develop, the prophet begins to ask questions. He expresses a wish to know who the killers are. He'd like to know their names if possible. And then eventually he asks to be shown the place where this is going to be happen. Or in some texts, the angel says, would you like me to show you where this is going to happen? Even the place is described very hazily. In the very earliest texts, it's just a place. And then it's a place with red soil or with red dust, the place of the martyrdom. And finally, it becomes the place that is characterized by sorrow and by distress. Karbala. At the deepest level, beyond all of this detail of the soil and the dust and the blood, beyond all the detail of wings of angels beating in the air and as they enter into history, beyond all the attempts by Salama to guard the door and her failure to stop, her necessary failure to stop this little boy from getting into the room, beyond the proposition that all of this is about the fact that the Husseini model is better than the Yazid model for human life and for human peace. Besides all of the details, all of the stands against injustice which form part of the story, these reports detail for me in a very particular manner how a particular group of people encountered the divine. And that's what our spirituality, yours and mine, is all about. How people encounter the divine in revelation, in prayer, in community. I know that there are some people, and I heard them, who would say that these accounts of Al-Hussein are just an attempt by the Shia to give angelic endorsement, that Hussein must have been right because angels said he was right. But in fact, the truth is that outside of the Shia texts, these stories exist in plenty of Sunni histories and Sunni collections of hadith. So they're not just an attempt to give an Husseini endorsement or an angelic endorsement by the Shia scholars. And nor are these later additions, as some like to say, that these are stories that came later. No, the earliest recounting of the story comes from the 2nd or 8th century. So the 2nd century Hijrah, the 8th century. That's a very, very early text. That's not a later insertion into a text of some angel coming with a message. Aside from purely academic motives, I was quite eager that I read these texts the way you read them, the way people of faith read them. Because in scholarship, where the world that I kind of live in, people read texts critically. But if you always read a text critically, you fail often to pick up the nuances and the beauty of the text. If a student only reads Shakespeare critically, he'll never read Shakespeare or understand it. If we read these hadith and these stories simply from the point of view of trying to prove whether they are true or not, then we miss the whole point. And the point of this book was not to present a critique of the text, but to offer to a non-Islamic world and non-Muslim readers some of the beauty of the poetry and the visions that surround Karbala. I know that critical analysis of text is very important, but I also know that sometimes we have to read it just to appreciate the sound of the divine that echo through them. That dream of Salama on the night of Karbala, of a long dead prophet sorrowing over Al-Hussein's death, that dream that tore her from her sleep just in time to hear the jinn lamenting in the air about the death of Al-Hussein, that dream now forms part of this inextinguishable echo of Karbala that nobody will ever be able to get rid of. It embraces secular and sacred history running on parallel lines, angelic interventions, predictive dreams, some of them very, very frightening, especially for those who killed Al-Khoei. This book is a little adventure, really, into some of the medieval and classical dream texts. I've tried to use the primary Arabic sources, as I did for the other books, and have traced the dreams from before Al-Hussein's birth until the apparitions after Karbala, witnessed by people, for example, like his faithless camel driver, who tried to rob his body and came to a terrible end, as the dream he had would tell him. Tradesmen, soldiers, even those who had no part in his death, all of them after Karbala had terrible dreams. So this event that you celebrate as part of your ongoing tradition, but especially obviously during the time of Muharram, the first 10 days of Muharram, this event is now inscribed into a communal remembrance. And the dreams that I've written about have helped to implant this remembrance in people's minds. It's an attempt to reread those texts and to catch again the sound of Jibril's voice, as authentic as it was when it first rang out in the house of Salama. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Clohessy, for such a wonderful presentation. I'd like to open to the floor to have some comments or questions. I think there's a lot covered there in such a short space of time, and I'm sure people have some questions to raise. Anyone who wants to ask a question? Yes, Sister Alia, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Father Christopher. That was amazing. Could you tell me what inspired you to write about these dreams?
It was really something quite boring, and that is that while I was researching the life of Lady Zainab, of course, a lot of her life is around those those 10 days journeying towards Karbala, the experiences she had psychologically and physically, and the brutality that she witnessed, and then of course after that, more brutality. But while I was researching that part of her life, I was coming across these dream encounters, and I just put them into a little file on my computer, and I thought, eventually I will do something with these. My plan at the moment, while I was writing about Lady Zainab, was that I was going to write on Al-Abbas, because nobody's written about Al-Abbas, really, and he's difficult to write about. But I put that off for a moment and said, let me write about the dreams first, because I quite like angels, and I have devotion to them, and I love these stories. I loved the person of Salama especially, and the way she tried to stop Al-Hussein. In many of the texts, she picks him up, and he starts to shout. So she puts him down again, and then he runs into the room. He's determined to be in the room, but that's part of the story. He has to be in the room so that the question can be asked, do you love him? And then the prediction can be made. So that was it. And of all my 3 books, I have great devotion to Lady Fatima and Lady Zainab, but this was the book that I enjoyed most of all, because it's got all kinds of elements in it that touch upon all kinds of things that Christians believe, that Catholics believe, in terms of angels especially, and in terms of the fact that God does use dreams. So that was it. It was, and lockdown did help, of course, because I was locked in a room, so I had to.
Anyone else? Any questions? Yeah, so go ahead.
Oh, many years ago, when I was studying Islam in Rome, we had a professor who lives in England, Michael Fitzgerald, an archbishop, who is an excellent Arabist and an expert Shi'i scholar. He's retired now, he lives up in Liverpool, and he was my lecturer. And he was the first one to recount the story of Karbala, and I can remember the day I heard it, saying to somebody, I'm going to spend the rest of my life working with this story, because this is the most interesting thing I've ever heard. In all the other Islam we studied, this was the thing. And then I took over from him as lecturer in Shi'i studies, and I was going to do my doctorate on Al-Hussein, kind of from a Christian point of view. And then, of course, I discovered Lady Fatima, and the fact that, once again, nobody was writing about her. There were books and texts, but nothing. So I wrote for my doctorate what I think was the first kind of substantial life of Lady Fatima. Not a complete life either, fragments of her life. Now many people have have written about her. So that's where it began. That was 97, 98, 99. And I can remember when I was going to write my doctorate, some of the professors of Islamic law, the priests I was with, were very cross. They said, "Oh, why do you waste your time with the Shia? The Shia are not important. You must do Islamic law." And the same priest who said that just before he died said to me, "I'm really glad you did the Shia, because they are very, very important." And I said, "Oh, I wish I could play a recording to you of what you said to me when I started." So that's where it began, yeah.
Yes, the lady behind. Yeah.
Look, you've got a whole lot of characters in the Ahl Bayt. You've got Al-Hussein himself, you've got Lady Fatima, those two particularly. And there are plenty of healthy, legitimate parallels, because not all parallels are good. Some of them don't really work. We kind of force people together. But between Al-Hussein and Jesus, let's say in the Christian tradition, and between Lady Fatima and Maryam in the Christian tradition, there are exceptionally strong parallels. So you have, martyrdom is either giving your life or having your life taken from you. It's one of the two. So here you have, in a sense, in both of those, Jesus and Al-Hussein, a combination where they willingly gave their lives and it was taken then by unjust people. So you have two men who, aside from the theology, because our theologies say different things, but just practically, you have two men who were willing to die for justice because they had a better model to propose. Al-Hussein was trying to propose a model that was better than the Yazid model of Islam. And even the Sunni historians admit that Yazid's model was a terrible model. They don't go further than that. And Al-Hussein was proposing a true Islamic model for society and against Yazid's. In the same way, in Christianity, Jesus was presenting a new way of understanding God and of living the commandments. In both cases, these men had their lives taken from them. In both cases, their blood was a redemptive act. Now, I use the word redemptive because at least one Shia author who wrote a book about Ashura, I don't know why it's gone out of my mind now. I'm quite embarrassed that it has, because it was the first book I read on Shia theology. It'll come to me. But his book on redemptive suffering in Islam, Mahmoud Ayub, redemptive suffering in Islam, he says we use the word redemptive differently in Islam from in Christianity, but in both cases the death redeemed, because in a sense Islam was struggling and suffering under the Yazidi model, and Al-Hussein's death redeemed that, or saved it from that model. So both deaths, in a sense, changed the course of history and changed human lives. And of course, both of these men have mothers who play fantastically important roles. The virgin, sorrowing mother, who is a great intercessor and prays for all of those who follow, are faithful to her, loyal to her son. In both traditions, that is why it's so easy for me to write these books, because the parallels are strong. I have seen parallels which I don't like, because some people try to force things together. And Al-Hussein is not Isa, and Isa is not Al-Hussein. They are two different people. They're not one person, and we have to give them the dignity of their respective identities without trying to mold them into one universal figure, redemptive. But they follow parallel paths of the fact that in every generation people have to stand up for justice, and this is an important point for me now in the times we're living in, that you will never have peace until you get justice. This was a thing that Al-Hussein understood. If you want peace in the Ummah, you have to have justice first. It is a thing that Christians have understood for a long time too, that justice is a prerequisite for peace. You can't force people to be nice to each other if they're treating each other unjustly. And therefore, in every generation, people have to take a stand for justice. You and I, we may never be on the world stage, but we still have to make decisions about justice almost daily, about the words we use, about the way we think, moral decisions. And those moral decisions can be really difficult for people, because your friends will look at you, or your family might. That's what Lady Zainab's role is, to remind us that we have to make those little decisions, that all of us live, if you like, in a Karbala space, where we have to make decisions about justice, even if nobody's looking. It's easy to be just when people are looking. What about when people are not looking? am I still just? Lady Zainab gives us that. So there are certainly exceptionally important parallels.
Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Look, this is an interesting question. It really is, because, of course, the Pope has just been to visit Grand Ayatollah Sistani. And more than that, he was in Najaf. So Najaf is a holy city. It's holy, I think, firstly because of the Hawza. So I like to speak of the spirit of Atusi that hovers over the Hawza that he founded. And then it is holy, secondly, because of the tomb of Ali, who is not trapped by his tomb, but his... And thirdly, it is holy because of the presence of the Grand Ayatollah. I certainly would imagine that the Pope, before he went, was told a little bit about the Hawza and about Ali and his importance and who the Shia are, although I think he probably knows that. I'm not convinced that he knows much about the Karbala, because it wouldn't form part of his field of interest. But I'm pretty sure that before he went, he got some very fast, very good lessons about the person of Ali, his tomb, why it's important, what a Hawza is, and also, of course, who Grand Ayatollah Sistani is, what role he plays. So I thought he might take me with him. I really did. Just for a moment, I thought, well, I think I'm the only one in Rome who has specialized in Shia Islam. Maybe I'll get a phone call saying, could you come to him? But I didn't get a phone call. So otherwise, I would have explained Karbala on the aeroplane across to him.
I think you need your own private visit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So take from the front first, and I'll get back to you.
Al-Abbas, a book about Al-Abbas, because Al-Abbas is an extraordinary human being about whom most people know very little. We know one thing, really, that he fetched water. He is a saqa, the water carrier, and that he carried the banner of Al-Hussein at Karbala, and that he was beloved of Al-Hussein. These two brothers loved each other, or half-brothers. But that's the narrative. I mean, the majlis for Al-Abbas, of course, there's a long narrative, but I would like to introduce a Western audience to Al-Abbas as a model of real. He is the opposite of ego. We're living in an era where ego plays a role. Everybody's interested in what they need. But he stands in the water, almost dead of thirst, and refuses to drink until Al-Hussein and the Ahl Bayt can also have water. That's an extraordinary sacrifice. So I've started working on reading the hadith, just the hadith, and then I will go to the history books, but the sources are very few about Al-Abbas. And it's going to be a long, but I'm determined that even if it's the last book I ever write, I'm going to get that book out about Al-Abbas.
Let's go ahead.
Well, that's a good question too, because there were attempts. There have been a number of attempts. John Paul II also was determined that he was going to get to Iraq, and every time it was blocked, sometimes by the government, sometimes by the Italian government. It all depended. Now, 2 years ago, the Pope met and signed a declaration with the Sheikh of Al-Azhar. And in a sense, I mean, although this is a bit of a generalization, in a sense, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar represents the Sunni world. But that meant he'd only met half the family. And I think he was determined that he was going to increase this embrace of the Islamic world from the Catholic point of view by meeting the Shia, and that Iraq would be a perfect place, because he went also to see the Christians in Iraq, but because the Iraqis, all of them, have come through the most terrible experiences. Secondly, because the Western world looks at Iraq as though it is nothing. And the Pope was saying, no, you're not nothing. You are as important on the world stage as any other nation. And thirdly, because he wanted to show that even if there was danger, he would still go and be with people. And finally, to meet a representative of the Shi'i world who's held in great esteem. And you have these two elderly men who've lived their lives prayerfully, who both believe in justice, who both hate violence. These two elderly men talking as brothers. We don't even know really what they said. It was a private conversation, and I'm glad because it was the symbolic gesture more than the conversation. I can imagine what they talked about, but it was that symbolic gesture that this was the church attempting to embrace the other side of the Islamic family, perhaps to speak on behalf of the Christians and the Muslims in Iraq who are suffering and have suffered so terribly, that solutions be found. It was the best visit the Pope has ever done, and I don't think he's ever going to do, as long as he lives, another visit that was as groundbreaking or as important. Most people don't know that now, but 10 years from now, people will realize what that visit meant. It was, as you said, groundbreaking, that a Pope should go. And he said, I'm not coming as a head of state, because he is a head of state, the Pope. So there were some people who said, you see, Sistani, he lives very humbly, the Pope lives in a palace. Well, no, the Pope's also a head of state. Vatican is its own independent state, so he's more than just a religious leader. But he said, I'm going as a pilgrim, not as a head of state. I'm going to see Al-Sistani as a pilgrim. Just think about what that means. It's extraordinary. So,
any more questions? I wanted to ask you, Professor, what are the ramifications of the Pope's visit for the Christian communities in Iraq, especially after the onslaught from ISIS and other terrorist organizations in the region?
It's going to be wait and see, I think, because so 2 years ago was this document that they signed called Human Fraternity, and people said to me, this document's very good. Yes, but I want to see the results, because it's not magic. It's not that, as if by magic tomorrow the situation's going to change, people are going to find things easier. I think, the Iraqis are still threatened in some ways by all of these external forces. They're still threatened by a world that has plundered them and then left them in chaos to rebuild from nothing. And so I think the fruits are going to take a while in terms of that. But I think the symbolic gesture brought hope to people, that there's still, that Islam and Christianity are not enemies. Why do people think they are? Here you have the two highest religious leaders embracing like brothers. Even Ali himself spoke those famous lines about my brothers in faith. But, this was a symbolic gesture to say that religion is not a violent thing, and it's people who are violent, not religion. It's people who are violent. Politics isn't violent, people are violent. Religion is not a violent thing, people are violent. We do the harm, because we're all sitting here together. Well, it's 99% Muslim, and 2 of us or 3 of us are not, but the point is we're sitting here together, quite able to talk about our faith without threatening each other and feeling threatened by the other. And the Pope, for me, that was a symbolic gesture which brings hope to people, that relationships can continue to be built. But I'm hoping also, because over the months now, to see how it pans out for the whole of Iraq in terms of giving Iraq an important psychological lift, that you are as important as any other country. You're not less. The West is inclined to treat the Arab world as kind of slightly backward, and yet it was in the Arab world that medicine was developing, and science and mathematics, when we were going through the Dark Ages. If you listen to language, English language, how many words like algebra come from working on these things? The Arab philosophers. So this modern view that we have, that the Arab world is somehow backward, that's wicked. And I think the Pope was trying to show that is a wicked worldview.
I'm going to ask my final question, and then we're going to wrap it up, hopefully. I want to bring it back to the discussion of Salama, and I want to ask you, has the Prophet ever kind of provided a prophecy like the story of Hussein in any other text that you've seen? Because that's quite a significant, almost 50 years before the incident took place, he kind of gives details of something that's going to happen, and one that symbolizes the importance of the event. So I wanted to, how important is that event because of the details, and is there any other place where the Prophet has also kind of foretold to that kind of level of detail?
There are a number of events. First of all, there are the events before the birth of Al-Khoei, at the moment when he's conceived. So this group of angels in strange form, and I recounted, I think, in the book of Lady Fatima, this group of angels comes to congratulate the Prophet on the conception of his grandson, but also to tell him about the death. Then, at the birth of Al-Khoei, you have the same thing happening. Groups of angels come in to congratulate the Prophet on the birth, but to warn him of the death. Years later, Al-Khoei is going to have a vision of his grandfather at his grandfather's tomb, in which his grandfather predicts his death. During the Battle of Karbala, or just before the Battle of Karbala, Al-Khoei, the day before, the night before, is sitting on a chair in front of his tent, and he dozes and he sees a vision of his grandfather saying, "You are journeying to join us. You're Fatima and Ali and Al-Hassan and Jafar and all of them, you're coming to join us." And then at the same time that Salama has this vision of the glass vial changing, one of the great Sunni transmitters, Ibn Abbas, he has a vision during the day of exactly the same thing. The Prophet covered with soil, and he's been to Karbala to collect the blood. He said, I'm collecting the blood of the Ahlul Bayt. And that's a Sunni transmitter, a famous Sunni transmitter. So we have a number of other examples where the Prophet himself is either having the vision or he's part of the vision.
But has the Prophet himself for any other, so I'm not talking about Karbala specifically, any other occasion in history where he's talked about a different event, not Karbala? Because the Prophet, for him to foretold the story, is there any others where he talks about another incident that happens besides Karbala?
I'm pretty sure there are, but I couldn't list them offhand. There is certainly one, but it's part of Revelation about Rum,
yeah,
about the defeat, and that's in Surah Rum,
yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
And there certainly is that, and there are a number of Quranic predictions of events that are going to happen, mostly military events about empires falling. So if you classify that as the Prophet, then but otherwise, I mean, it's not an area I know that well. Yeah.
That's fine. I just want to reiterate my thanks to Professor Clohessy for spending his afternoon with us. He has a wonderful publication. He's just skimmed the surface by alluding to some of the points that are within the publication. But I encourage everybody to grab a copy now while it's available. Although you can purchase it online, the details will be with the organizers. I think this will be posted also on the website, and I think the Al-Khoei will also send it out on the next newswire or on their social media to kind of further enhance or kind of publicize this publication. Really proud of Professor Clohessy for putting this together. It's really fantastic and it's revolutionary and it's unique. I haven't seen anything like this before, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to really kind of dig into it. I know we are after lockdown, but we can still read just like Professor Clohessy was writing in that period. Thank you once again for coming. I believe there's some refreshments on the back, and if you get a book now and get it signed, you can get a picture with Professor Clohessy. Thank you very much.